There's even under consideration a new concept where we give 20% of the DOGE savings to American citizens.
What would you do if these savings promises turned out to be a mathematical nightmare? Millions of Americans are already counting on receiving these Trump DOGE dividend refunds, but here's the reality. $55 billion saved in the first month when they need $110 billion every single month to hit their target. And that's the real story that most news outlets aren't explaining properly. In this video, I'll show you the 3 major legal hurdles this plan faces, exactly who qualifies for payments, hint, it's not everybody, and most importantly, what you should actually do with your money while this plays out. The truth behind these numbers might surprise you, and what also might surprise you is how easy it is to remove your personal data from online data brokers, thanks to the sponsor of today's video, but more on that later. What if I told you that the $55 billion DOGE saved in its first month sounds impressive until you actually look at the math? I know headlines about the Department of Government Efficiency's first month savings have been everywhere, with some people already planning how they would spend their potential refund checks, but there's a critical detail that most people are missing when they get excited about these numbers. Let's break down the real math here. In order to reach that $2 trillion savings goal by July of 2026, DOGE would need to identify over $110 billion in savings every single month from now until then. That's more than double what they managed in their highly publicized first month. With only 18 months remaining until DOGE is scheduled to dissolve, they would need to consistently save about $111 billion monthly, and maintaining double your initial performance for nearly a year and a half straight seems extremely unlikely, especially after picking the low-hanging fruit. Now let's examine what DOGE has actually trimmed so far. They've identified $6.5 billion from USAID, $500 million from the Department of Education, $230 million from Social Security, $190 million from General Services, $170 million from Agriculture, $152 million from Health and Human Services, $119 million from Commerce, and $30 million from Transportation. When you stack these numbers against the monthly target they need to hit, the gap becomes glaring. This leads us to a huge political constraint that makes the math even more challenging, and that's that President Trump has explicitly stated that cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and defense spending are off limits. These protected programs aren't just a small portion of spending, they represent roughly 2/3 of the entire federal budget. Imagine trying to renovate a house while declaring that 66% of the rooms were untouchable. You'd have to make extreme changes to the remaining spaces, and given this limitation, we're facing a mathematical impossibility. The total discretionary budget, everything outside those protected categories, amounts to approximately $1.7 trillion. So DOGE is attempting to cut $2 trillion from a pot that only contains $1.7 trillion. It's like trying to squeeze 20 gallons of water from a 17-gallon tank. It's physically impossible no matter how hard you squeeze. Even Elon Musk has started tempering expectations. He recently downgraded the $2 trillion figure to a best-case scenario and suggested actual savings might reach around $1 trillion. When the person heading the initiative is already cutting the target in half, that's a major red flag about the original goal's feasibility. Now, economic experts have consistently highlighted this problem, noting that reaching $2 trillion would essentially require eliminating nearly every remaining federal program that isn't explicitly protected, which is a scenario that's politically untenable and would disrupt services that millions of Americans depend on daily. The math has serious implications for those promised refunds, and if DOGE manages to save only half their target, any potential refund would shrink proportionally from the $5,000 per household figure that some reports have mentioned. Now, finding government inefficiencies is a worthwhile goal most Americans support regardless of a political affiliation, but we need to confront the stark reality that the gap between DOGE's ambitious targets and mathematical possibility is much wider than what most people realize. But before we talk about who would actually qualify for the DOGE dividends, if you're enjoying this content so far, please hit the like button for the algorithm and consider subscribing. It's a free way you can show support and it is much appreciated. Now, in terms of who would actually qualify for DOGE dividends, most Americans are buzzing about potential refund checks from DOGE's cost-cutting efforts, but there's a crucial detail that's being overlooked. Not everyone would actually get a check. In fact, the fine print of James Fishback's original proposal, the one that inspired Elon Musk and caught Trump's attention, reveals a system that works almost exactly opposite to how the COVID stimulus checks operated. DOGE dividends would only be distributed to households with a federal tax liability. This means that if you don't owe federal income taxes after your deductions and credits, you'd receive nothing. In fact, approximately 30% of Americans would be completely excluded. Now, unlike the stimulus checks that prioritized lower income families, this plan leaves millions without any benefit, while at the same time directing the largest payments to those with higher incomes. Now, let me break down who would actually qualify. Only about 70% of Americans have a federal tax liability after standard deductions and credits. Roughly 80 to 90 million households would potentially be eligible, and payments would be proportional to the taxes paid, not distributed equally. Now, imagine this scenario. A single mom working 2 jobs who qualifies for enough tax credits to eliminate her federal tax liability would get absolutely nothing from DOGE. Meanwhile, her neighbor who earns 6 figures might receive thousands in dividends. She could be watching news reports about money coming back to Americans while her money box remains empty, and this distribution would create a situation where the wealthiest Americans receive some of the largest checks. For example, someone who paid $100,000 in federal taxes would get a substantially larger refund than someone who only paid $100. It completely reverses how most government assistance typically works, where the benefits target those with the greatest financial need. Now, the political challenges here are obvious. Many economists and policy experts have raised concerns that this approach could be seen as regressive by providing substantial benefits to higher income Americans while excluding those with the lowest incomes. And this means that the public reaction could be severe when people realize that while the wealthy receive the largest payments, a third of Americans would get nothing at all. Now, there's also the practical challenge of implementation, as any distribution formula would require congressional approval, adding another added layer of complexity. Congress would need to determine exactly how the money gets distributed, who qualifies, and how much each household receives, which is a process that could become politically contentious. And when you examine the full picture, the DOGE dividend system creates a stark contrast to pandemic stimulus checks that most Americans received regardless of income up to certain thresholds. Those COVID payments went to nearly everyone, with only the higher income earners excluded. Now, this DOGE plan flips this model, excluding millions of lower income Americans while potentially giving substantial amounts to higher earners. And this approach raises serious questions about fairness and who should benefit from government efficiency. Should savings from cutting government waste go primarily to those who pay the most in taxes? Or should they benefit all Americans, particularly those who might need financial assistance the most? These complex questions aren't getting enough attention in the current conversation about DOGE dividends. And while there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding DOGE and how it will process its dividend payments, one thing is certain, and that is that having your personal data removed online is possible through the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. Now, this is a service that I personally use, and they have removed my personal information from dozens of sites. Data breaches are becoming more common than ever, and that is why Delete Me is more important than ever. It helps you remove your personal information, like your name, address, phone number, and more from data websites that buy, sell, and trade your data. The process is simple. Simply submit your information, and within 7 days you receive a report showing exactly where your data was found. And Delete Me continues to monitor and remove your data all year long, and I can tell you from personal experience, it actually works. Now, you can get 20% off all US plans today by heading over to the link in the description down below, or simply scan the QR code here on the screen to get started and join the thousands of people who trust Delete Me to protect their online privacy and take control of your data today. Those fairness questions might end up being completely theoretical because there's a shocking reality about DOGE that most people don't realize. Despite all the headlines and promises, this advisory group operates with about as much spending authority as a committee that meets for coffee, which is to say absolutely none. DOGE was created through an executive order, not legislation. This means that the group exists purely to give advice. They can identify potential areas for cuts and make recommendations, but they really lack any direct authority to cut even a single dollar from the federal budget themselves. According to our Constitution, only Congress has the power to decide how federal money is spent and how tax laws work. So even if DOGE identifies $2 trillion in waste, they can't redirect that money to taxpayers' bank accounts. Any dividend plan must go through Congress first, introducing significant complications. Now, this constitutional roadblock creates a major hurdle that rarely makes headlines. Key Republican leaders have already expressed hesitation about the dividend idea, and House Speaker Mike Johnson has publicly stated that he'd prefer the money go toward U.S. debt payments rather than issuing refunds. Representative Eric Burleson has opposed sending checks to Americans entirely, pointing to the country's massive deficit as justification. So we're looking at a situation where the president's own party might block attempts to turn DOGE's recommendations into actual refund checks, a political reality often overlooked amid the excitement about potential dividends. DOGE is also facing multiple legal challenges that could derail the entire initiative before it gains momentum. momentum. Some lawsuits question whether the group should have access to sensitive data across federal agencies, and others target the very creation of Doge itself, questioning its legal establishment and right to exist. In the words of economist Jessica Rydell at the Manhattan Institute, Doge has no legal or constitutional authority to cut spending, adding that saving $2 trillion would require eliminating nearly every remaining federal program. And she warned that Doge's savings so far could be reversed by the courts for bypassing Congress, a devastating assessment about the fundamental viability of Doge as a program. So let's consider what this means. Even if Doge identifies potential cuts and those recommendations somehow make it through Congress, the courts could still step in and essentially reverse everything. The government might announce cuts, maybe even start implementing them, only to have the judge rule that the whole process was unconstitutional from the get. And for anyone counting on receiving these dividend checks, that's a serious problem. The constitutional requirement for changing how money flows through the government isn't a technicality, it's a fundamental principle that can't be bypassed even with presidential support. When you hear politicians promising that Doge will put money back in your pocket, remember, there's a massive gap between identifying wasteful spending and actually redirecting those funds to taxpayers. Even with the president's backing, these individual dividends face three major obstacles. They need congressional approval, which isn't guaranteed. They face political opposition within Trump's own party, and they're vulnerable to legal challenges that could invalidate the entire initiative. And beyond the legal battle lies an economic powder keg that could explode in your wallet. While Trump's team insists these dividends would be absolutely not inflationary, the Federal Reserve's latest meeting minutes tell a completely different story. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has gone on record claiming Doge dividends would actually be disinflationary, arguing that since the money was already budgeted to be spent, redirecting it to taxpayers wouldn't create additional pressure on prices. Consider this important twist. The Federal Reserve has already signaled they're pumping the brakes on interest rate cuts because they're worried about rising prices. Their policy is now significantly less restrictive than before, and they're still not planning more cuts anytime soon. Looking at the Fed officials' most recent meeting discussions, they specifically mentioned concerns about companies passing tariff costs directly to consumers, which is a clear red flag for your future purchasing power. Now, history offers us a sobering lesson here. Those pandemic stimulus checks that were supposed to help without causing inflation, well, economists now attribute about 42% of COVID-era inflation directly to those payments, and that was with money spread out over 3 years. If Doge suddenly dumps billions into Americans' bank accounts all at once while simultaneously restricting imports with tariffs, we're potentially setting up an inflation sequel that would make the original look like a preview. And the timing couldn't be worse given American household finances today. We're facing all-time high debt levels combined with historically low savings rates. The reality? Most people won't put their $5,000 Doge check in savings. They'll spend it. And this spending surge, paired with supply restrictions from new tariffs, creates a perfect storm for price increases across the board. Now, this follows basic economic principles. Boost demand with tax refunds while restricting supply with tariffs, and prices will inevitably rise. It's like trying to force more water through a narrowing pipe. A pressure builds until something gives way, and in this case, it's the value of your dollar. Durable goods would see the biggest price jumps, affecting everything from appliances to electronics to vehicles, and economists outside the Trump administration are raising serious concerns about these disinflationary claims. If Doge fails to achieve its ambitious cost-cutting goals but still issues the $5,000 checks, we could see significant price increases on everyday items. And the risk increases if Doge's cost-cutting effectiveness gets exaggerated, something the numbers suggest is entirely possible. The irony cuts deep. A program designed to put more money in Americans' pockets could make everything more expensive, effectively nullifying any financial benefit. And even worse, it might force the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates higher for longer to combat inflation, keeping your mortgage, car loan, and credit card rates elevated. Think about your own financial situation. If you get a $5,000 check, but your grocery bill jumps 10%, your car payment increases by $100 monthly due to higher interest rates, and replacement appliances suddenly cost 15% more, are you actually coming out ahead? For most Americans, that math simply doesn't add up in their favor. So after laying out all the facts, what's the bottom line here? The Doge dividend, this idea that could send thousands back to Americans, seems increasingly unlikely to materialize as advertised, and the math simply doesn't add up. The legal hurdles are substantial, and the economic implications could actually hurt your wallet in the long run. And if you want my 2 cents, here's my advice. Financial experts are unanimously suggesting that you shouldn't count on these potential dividends for your financial planning. Treat any possible Doge payment as an unexpected bonus rather than guaranteed income, and instead focus on what you can can control: building your emergency fund, investing consistently, and paying down high interest debt. That's all I've got. I'm curious what you all think about this, so drop a comment in the comment section below, letting me know what you think about Doge and the refunds, because even if the full $5,000 checks never materialize, there will definitely be financial ripple effects worth preparing for.